What if true protection didn't come from those who promised safety, but from those who understood power's real cost? In the marble and crystal world of Aurelius, the city's most exclusive restaurant, Mercy wore Italian leather and spoke in silences that could end lives. Carolyn Pittman's cheek pressed against the cold marble floor, the impact still ringing through her skull. Her white service uniform, the one she'd scrubbed clean at midnight in her apartment sink, was now smeared with the Chateau Margaux she'd spilled when Richard Ashford had grabbed her wrist and twisted. At 29, she'd learned to make herself invisible, to absorb cruelty like it was part of the job description. But this was different. Ashford loomed above her, his Brioni suit jacket discarded on a nearby chair, his face flushed with the kind of rage that came from never hearing the word no. His polished Oxford shoe hovered inches from her ribs. She could smell the cognac on his breath, see the twisted satisfaction in his eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." She didn't know that across the dining room, a man in a midnight black Tom Ford suit had stopped mid-conversation, Lee Dong-wook, whose name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys from Seoul to San Francisco, whose organization moved more money in a week than most people saw in lifetimes, had witnessed everything, and what he'd just seen made something cold and absolute settle in his chest, something that hadn't stirred in years. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Carolyn had been working at Aurelius for 11 months, ever since her younger sister Maya's diagnosis had turned their world inside out. The experimental treatment cost more than Carolyn made in a year. The restaurant job barely covered the rent on the studio apartment in the worst part of town, but combined with her morning shift at the bakery and weekend catering gigs, she was staying afloat. Barely. The work itself didn't bother her. She'd learned long ago to find dignity in honest labor, even when it meant smiling through condescension from people who spent more on wine than she made in a month. Most patrons were indifferent, wealthy enough to not see the staff as fully human, but not cruel about it. The regular customers, the ones who knew her name, sometimes left generous tips that meant she could buy Maya's favorite books. But lately, there'd been more nights like tonight. Patrons who seemed to take pleasure in their power, who viewed the waitstaff as props in their theater of dominance. Aurelius wasn't just expensive, it was a fortress of privilege. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering harbor. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across tables dressed in Irish linen. The reservation list had a 6-month wait, and the Maire D could end social careers with a single headshake. It was also, though few knew it, neutral ground for the city's most dangerous operators. The private dining rooms in the back had hosted negotiations that shifted millions. Agreements sealed with handshakes that were more binding than any contract. The owners understood that certain customers required absolute discretion. Tonight, Lee Dong-wook occupied table 7, the corner booth with clear sightlines to every entrance and exit. His associates, 2 men who looked like they'd been carved from granite, flanked him at respectful distances. They'd been discussing a shipping route dispute, the kind of conversation where the wrong word could trigger consequences measured in bodies, not dollars. Richard Ashford III represented everything Lee had learned to recognize and despise. Old money wearing new arrogance, the kind of man who'd inherited wealth but confused it with worth. He sat with 3 other men in expensive suits, their laughter too loud, their gestures too expansive. They were celebrating something, a hostile takeover perhaps, or the gutting of a pension fund. Ashford had been snapping his fingers at servers all night, sending back perfectly prepared dishes with invented complaints. Lee had watched it all with the patience of a predator, the casual cruelty, the need to diminish others to feel substantial. When Carolyn had stumbled barely, just a fraction of a step when another server brushed past her, and a few drops of wine had landed on Ashford's sleeve, Lee had seen the man's face transform. Not anger, something worse. Opportunity. Ashford had followed Carolyn toward the kitchen service corridor, away from the main dining room. His voice had started low, venomous, then grown louder as he'd backed her against the wall near the coat check. The words weren't new to Carolyn, variations on stupidity, worthlessness, the threat of getting her fired, of making sure she never worked anywhere decent again. Then he'd grabbed her wrist, twisted it. When she'd reflexively pulled back, he'd shoved her, hard. The sound of her body hitting the floor had carried across the dining room like a gunshot in the careful quiet. Now, as Ashford's foot lifted for the kick that would crack her ribs, that would mark her with bruises she'd carry for weeks, Carolyn did the only thing left to her. She begged, "Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The room held its breath, and then Lee Dong-wook stood up. 3 hours before Richard Ashford's hand closed around her wrist, Carolyn had stood in the pre-shift meeting room, reciting the evening specials like a prayer she'd memorized without believing. Seared foie gras with black cherry gastrique, wild Alaskan halibut with saffron beurre blanc, Wagyu beef that cost more per ounce than she made in a day. The words tasted like ash, but she smiled and nodded when the floor manager reminded them that exceptional service meant anticipating needs before they were spoken, that their tips depended on making invisible people feel seen while remaining invisible themselves. She was good at invisible. 5 shifts a week at Aurelius. Mornings at the bakery on 3rd Street where she shaped croissants before dawn. Weekends serving canapés at gallery openings and charity galas where people who could solve Maya's problems with a single check wrote 5-figure donations to save endangered orchids. The math was simple and impossible. Maya's treatment cost $8,000 a month. Carolyn made maybe 4 on a good month, and the gap between them was measured in her sister's labored breathing, in the way Maya smiled and said she was fine, even when the pain made her curl into herself like a question mark. The private care facility, the one where they actually managed pain instead of just warehousing the sick, had a 6-month waiting list and required 3 months paid up front. Carolyn kept a notebook in her locker where she tracked every dollar, every tip, calculating and recalculating the same arithmetic that never quite added up. She was 8 months away from the deposit. Maybe 7 if she picked up more catering shifts. Maybe 6 if she stopped eating lunch. Richard Ashford had arrived at 7:30 with his entourage of sharks in suits, men whose laughter carried the edge of things breaking. She'd recognized him immediately, hedge fund manager, his face occasionally gracing the business section, the kind of man who collected modern art and 18th century wine with the same casual veracity he applied to destroying pension funds. He'd barely glanced at her when she'd taken his drink order, his attention fixed on performing wealth for his companions, but she'd felt the assessment anyway, the way his gaze had lingered just long enough to categorize and dismiss her. Table 7 had been occupied since 6. Lee Dong-wook and his associates had ordered with quiet precision the tasting menu, wine pairings selected by vintage rather than price, and then settled into the kind of conversation that happened in undertones, in languages that shifted mid-sentence, Korean, then Mandarin, occasionally English when the terms required it, shipping manifests, port access, names that meant nothing to Carolyn but everything to the 2 granite-faced men who flanked Lee like bookends of violence barely contained. She'd served them twice, each time hyper-aware of the way Lee tracked her movement with eyes that processed information like a predator calculating trajectories. He never smiled, never made small talk, but when he thanked her in that precise, unaccented English, something in his tone suggested he saw more than she wanted visible. The men at table 7 didn't demand. They requested. They never snapped fingers or raised voices, but the air around them carried weight, the kind of pressure that came from knowing you could reshape reality with a phone call and never face consequences. Carolyn had learned to read her tables the way cartographers read terrain. Table 7 was dangerous but contained, power that knew itself and didn't need performance. Table 12, Ashford's table, was different. That was power that needed witnesses, that fed on diminishment. She'd approached them with the same careful smile she wore like armor, and felt the evening begin its long slide toward catastrophe. It happened during the wine service, that delicate choreography of bottle presentation and pour that Carolyn had executed flawlessly hundreds of times. She'd been reaching across to refill Ashford's glass, a 2009 Chateau Margaux, that cost more than her monthly rent when Marcus, the sommelier, brushed past her with an ice bucket, his elbow catching her shoulder at precisely the wrong angle. The bottle tilted, just a fraction, just enough. 3 drops of wine landed on Ashford's sleeve, 3 dark droplets against pristine white cotton, spreading like accusation. The table went quiet. Ashford stared at his cuff as if she'd drawn blood, his face transitioning through surprise into something colder and more purposeful. "You stupid!" He caught himself, glanced at his companions, recalibrated. When he looked up at Carolyn, his smile was surgical. "Of course. I should have known better than to expect competence from someone who probably can't even afford to drink this. Sir, I'm so sorry. I'll get that cleaned immediately." Carolyn's voice stayed level, professional, even as heat crawled up her neck. "You'll get me a new shirt." Ashford's tone was pleasant now, enjoying itself. "Actually, you know what? You'll pay for a new shirt. This is custom. Charvet, do you even know what that means?" He turned to his companions, performing now. "I doubt she makes in a month what this shirt costs." She wanted to say, "I make in 3 months what that shirt costs, and I could list every seam and button because I've spent hours calculating exactly these kinds of humiliations." Instead, she said, "I'll speak to the manager about compensation, sir." "No." Ashford stood, and the movement carried threat. "I'll speak to the manager. About your immediate termination." He was taller than she'd realized, or maybe she'd just gotten smaller. "Unless you'd like to apologize properly. On your knees might be appropriate." The words hung in the gilded air. His companions shifted, uncomfortable but not intervening. Carolyn felt the weight of every eye in the dining room, including the cold assessment from table 7, where Lee Dong-wook had stopped mid-conversation. She turned toward the kitchen, maintaining dignity by inches. "I'll get the manager." "Sir." Ashford's hand shot out and caught her wrist, his grip tight enough to grind bone. "I didn't dismiss you. Please let go." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Please?" He twisted her wrist, and pain lanced up her arm. "You think please means something? You think manners matter from someone like you?" He was moving now, forcing her backward toward the coat check corridor, away from witnesses, his voice dropping to something intimate and vicious. "People like you exist to serve people like me. When you fail at the only thing you're good for, there are consequences." Carolyn tried to pull free. His other hand came up and shoved her, hard, center mass. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the carpet edge. The world tilted. Her skull cracked against marble with a sound like something final. And then she was on the floor, tasting copper, watching Ashford's polished Oxford lift toward her ribs. "Please," she whispered. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The marble was cold against Carolyn's cheek, colder than she expected, and for a strange suspended moment that was all she could process the temperature differential. The way her body heat was already leaching into stone that had probably cost more than Maya's entire treatment. Her skull throbbed where it had connected with the floor, a deep ache that would bloom into something worse by morning. But that wasn't the pain that made her vision blur. She could hear them. The diners. The careful clink of silverware had stopped. Conversation suspended mid-word, as if the entire restaurant had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. They were watching, not intervening, not calling for help, just watching with the detached curiosity of people observing a car accident from a safe distance. She was entertainment now. Spectacle. The confirmation of every hierarchy they'd internalized, that some people mattered and some people were simply scenery that occasionally malfunctioned. Ashford loomed above her, his shadow falling across her crumpled form like a verdict. She could see his face from this angle, see the flush of exhilaration coloring his cheeks, the way his pupils had dilated with something that looked almost like pleasure. His Oxford shoe lifted, the leather catching the chandelier light, and she understood with sudden clarity that he was going to do it. He was going to kick her. Not because she'd spilled wine, not even because she'd tried to walk away, but because he could. Because in this moment, he held absolute power over her body, and exercising that power would feel better than any deal he'd ever closed. "Please," the word came out broken, smaller than a whisper. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." The silence that followed swallowed sound itself. Even the kitchen noise seemed to vanish, the distant clatter of plates and murmur of prep cooks suspended as if the universe had paused to witness what would happen next. Carolyn could hear her own heartbeat, could feel tears tracking hot paths down her temples into her hairline, could taste the humiliation like copper on her tongue. And then, through the silence, came a different sound. Chair legs against hardwood. Slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that carried weight beyond the physical. Lee Dong-wook rose from table 7 like a dark thing unfolding from shadows. He didn't hurry, didn't speak. He simply stood, and the air pressure in the room changed. His associates remained seated, their postures alert but still, their hands visible on the white tablecloth in a carefully orchestrated display of restraint that somehow made them seem more dangerous, not less. Lee's eyes dark and absolutely level, fixed on Ashford, with the kind of focus a surgeon applies to a tumor. No anger, no righteousness, just cold, precise attention that suggested he was calculating angles, measuring distances, mapping the most efficient route from observation to action. Ashford's foot hesitated mid-arc, his attention fragmenting. He glanced toward the movement, toward this man in the corner who had no business involving himself in what was clearly a private matter of discipline. His face twisted with irritation, with the particular annoyance of someone interrupted mid-pleasure. Lee took his first step forward, then another. Steady as a metronome, silent as gravity, the room held its breath and waited. Lee Dong-wook crossed the dining room the way glaciers move mountains, inevitable, unhurried, and fundamentally unstoppable. Each step measured exactly the same distance as the last, his Italian leather shoes making no sound against the hardwood, his hands loose at his sides in a way that suggested complete control over violence, rather than its absence. The space between tables seemed to expand for him. Other diners unconsciously shifting their chairs, their bodies, creating a corridor through the room that led directly to where Ashford stood over Carolyn's crumpled form. He didn't look at the other patrons, didn't acknowledge the sommelier frozen near the wine station, or the floor manager emerging white-faced from the kitchen. His attention remained fixed on Ashford with the single-minded focus of a missile locked on target, and there was something in that absolute concentration that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Ashford had lowered his foot not from conscience but from the distraction of this approaching figure, and now he turned fully to face Lee, his expression cycling through confusion into defensive anger. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "I'm dealing with incompetent staff. It doesn't concern—" Lee stopped 3 feet away, said nothing, simply looked at him. It wasn't a glare, wasn't a threat displayed across his features. Lee's face remained perfectly neutral, almost serene, but his eyes held something that made Ashford's words die in his throat. It was the kind of look that saw through skin to bone, that calculated exactly how much pressure a human body could withstand before it broke, that had witnessed suffering and death and cruelty, and catalogued them all with the same clinical precision he might apply to a balance sheet. "Do you know who I am?" Ashford tried, volume compensating for the sudden uncertainty in his posture. "I could buy this restaurant. I could buy 10 of these restaurants. Whatever you think you're—" Lee's head tilted 1 degree to the left. That was all. A fractional shift that somehow communicated volumes that Ashford's wealth was irrelevant, that his status meant nothing, that in this moment he was simply meat and bone, and the thin veneer of civilization that could be stripped away with remarkable ease. Around them, the other diners were moving now. Not fleeing exactly, but creating distance. Chairs scraping backward with the careful deliberation of people who'd suddenly realized they were too close to something that might detonate. The couple at table 4 gathered their belongings with practiced speed. The business dinner at table 9 settled their check via hand signals to a server who materialized and vanished like smoke. Even Ashford's companions had shifted back from the confrontation, their earlier loyalty evaporating in the face of whatever they recognized in Lee's stillness. Carolyn, still on the floor, watched through her curtain of hair as the 2 men faced each other. Ashford vibrating with adrenaline and indignation. Lee absolutely motionless, as if he'd been carved from something denser than flesh. The contrast was almost obscene, chaos meeting order, noise encountering silence, and losing. Ashford's hand twitched toward his pocket, toward his phone, toward the idea of consequences. Lee's eyes tracked the movement with the attention of a snake watching a mouse contemplate running. "You're making a mistake," Ashford said, but his voice had lost altitude. Lee spoke for the first time, his English precise and unaccented, each word weighted with finality. "No, you did." Ashford's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine searching for a winning combination. He settled on indignation, puffing his chest in a way that might have worked in boardrooms but looked absurd here, facing a man who regarded him the way entomologists regard specimens. "I don't know who you think you are, but I have connections. Real connections. The mayor, the police commissioner, half the city council." Lee said something in Korean, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. The words flowed like water over stone, unhurried and unstoppable. The taller of Lee's associates, the one who'd been sitting ramrod straight throughout dinner, rose and moved to stand just behind Lee's right shoulder. His voice, when he translated, carried the same studied neutrality as Lee's original statement, but in English the words landed like stones in still water. "Mr. Lee says that he knows about the $17 million you moved through the Cayman account last Thursday. He knows about the pension fund. He knows about the photographs." The blood drained from Ashford's face so quickly it was almost clinical. His mouth opened, closed, his earlier bluster collapsing into something raw and animal. Those are lies. Slander. I'll have my lawyers." Lee spoke again, shorter this time, and the bodyguard translated with what might have been the ghost of satisfaction. "Mr. Lee suggests that perhaps your lawyers are already quite busy with other matters. The SEC investigation, for instance. Though he notes that particular problem could accelerate significantly if certain documents were to surface. You're threatening me." Ashford's voice had climbed an octave, the veneer of sophistication peeling away to reveal the entitled child beneath. "You can't just all call. Mr. Lee is not threatening you," the translator continued, though Lee hadn't spoken. "He is simply observing that men who enjoy causing pain to those without power often have more interesting vulnerabilities than they realize. He finds it curious that someone so concerned with dominance would send emails from an unsecured network. Very curious." Ashford stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his face working through calculations that weren't adding up. Around them, the restaurant had achieved a silence so complete that Carolyn could hear her own breathing, could hear the distant hum of the kitchen hood vents, could hear the moment when Ashford's reality restructured itself around a new and terrifying understanding. Lee tilted his head toward the door. Not a gesture, exactly. Just a slight acknowledgement that exits existed and might be wise to use. This isn't over, Ashford tried. But the words came out thin, desperate. Lee smiled then, for the first time, and it was worse than his silence. The smile suggested that he knew exactly how this story ended, had known from the beginning, and found Ashford's performance almost endearing in its futility. He said something else in Korean, very softly. The translator leaned forward slightly. Mr. Lee says that you are correct. It is not over. It is over when he says it is over. He suggests you leave now, while leaving remains an option. The second bodyguard materialized at Ashford's elbow. Carolyn hadn't even seen him move his hand, hovering near but not touching Ashford's arm, creating a corridor toward the exit that felt both like an escape route and a cattle chute. Ashford looked at his companions, seeking support that had already abandoned him. He looked at the other diners, finding only averted eyes. He looked at Carolyn, still on the floor, and whatever he saw in her expression made him flinch. Then he was walking, then stumbling, then gone, the bodyguard shadowing him through the door and into the night where expensive cars and ruined reputations waited in equal measure. The silence after Ashford's departure felt different than the silence that had preceded it, less anticipatory, more like the aftermath of a storm when the air pressure hasn't quite normalized. Carolyn remained on the floor, her body still braced for impact that was no longer coming, her mind struggling to process the violence of what she'd witnessed even though no one had thrown a single punch. Lee turned from the door and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same precise deliberation he'd applied to everything else, he lowered himself into a crouch beside her. Not kneeling the angle was wrong for that. Too practical, too much like a businessman examining damaged merchandise. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a handkerchief, white linen with initials embroidered in a navy so dark it was almost black, and held it out to her. Carolyn stared at the offered cloth as if it might be a trap. Her hands shook as she took it, the fabric expensive enough that she was afraid to bleed on it. Though she suspected she already was, she pressed it to the cut above her eyebrow where her head had met the floor, felt the sting, tasted the salt of tears she hadn't realized she was still crying. Why do you stay? Lee's English carried no accent she could identify, as if he'd learned the language from recordings rather than people. His tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than sympathy. The same tone someone might use to ask why you'd chosen an inefficient route. I need the job. The answer came automatically. The same response she'd given herself 1,000 times. That is not an answer. He shifted his weight slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. There are many jobs. You stay here, in this place, accepting this treatment. Why? Carolyn's throat tightened. She didn't owe this stranger her story. Didn't owe him anything except perhaps gratitude she didn't know how to articulate. But something in his directness, in the way he dismantled Ashford without raising his voice, made lying seem pointless. My sister, Maya. She's sick. The treatment costs. Her voice cracked. It costs more than I can make anywhere else. The tips here, they're enough to almost. Lee repeated the word as if tasting it, finding it unsatisfactory. He stood in one fluid motion, looking down at her from his full height, and for a moment she thought he was finished with her, that this brief intervention had satisfied whatever impulse had moved him to act. Instead, he said something that surprised her. He is weak. Sir? That man. Ashford. Lee's lip curled with something that might have been disgust if it had contained more emotion. He requires an audience for his cruelty. He needs witnesses to feel powerful, needs to diminish others to feel substantial. This is not strength. This is pathology masquerading as authority. He looked toward the door where Ashford had disappeared. Truly powerful people do not waste energy on performance. They simply act, and the world reshapes itself accordingly. Carolyn pulled herself into a sitting position, her back against the wall, still clutching his handkerchief. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No. Lee looked at her with those unreadable eyes. It is supposed to make you understand that you have been suffering under a system designed by weak men who mistake cruelty for competence. And weak systems can be restructured. Lee extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Carolyn took it. His grip was firm, impersonal, and he pulled her to her feet, with the efficient strength of someone who'd done this before, lifted people from floors, from wreckage, from the aftermath of decisions gone wrong. He released her hand immediately, maintaining that careful distance between assistance and intimacy. I was 16 when I understood that survival requires clarity, he said, his tone still conversational. as if they were discussing market trends rather than standing in the ruins of her dignity. My father ran a small import business in Busan, legal, legitimate, barely profitable. When he refused to pay protection money to the local organization, they burned it to the ground. He rebuilt. They burned it again. The third time they broke his hands so he couldn't rebuild. Carolyn watched his face for emotion and found none. Just the steady recitation of facts filed under ancient history. I learned that the world does not reward honesty or hard work. It rewards understanding power and knowing where you stand within its structure. My father believed in dignity through labor. He died poor and broken. Lee's eyes refocused on her, sharp and assessing. You are on the same path, working 3 jobs, calculating impossible mathematics, hoping that if you just endure enough, the universe will notice your suffering and adjust accordingly. It won't. End quote. The words should have been cruel, but they landed with the weight of diagnosis rather than judgment. Carolyn's hands tightened on the handkerchief, the fabric now spotted with her blood, and she found she couldn't argue with him. I'm going to offer you something, Lee continued. Not from kindness, I am not a kind man, but because I've built my organization on the principle that talent matters more than pedigree, and you've demonstrated something rare tonight. I got attacked and cried on your handkerchief. You stayed on the floor and asked not to be hurt worse, knowing that pride would cost you more than you could afford. His head tilted fractionally. That is not weakness. That is ruthless prioritization. I respect that. He stepped back, creating space for what came next. Option 1. I give you $100,000. Enough for your sister's treatment. Enough to relocate somewhere that men like Ashford don't know your name. You walk out of here tonight, and you never work in a place like this again. Ashford will receive additional reminders that you are not to be contacted or considered. You will be safe. Carolyn's breath caught. 100,000. The entire architecture of her life restructured in a single sentence. Option 2. Lee's voice didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened. You work for me, not as a server, not as anyone's subordinate in the way you understand that word, as someone I can trust with sensitive information, complex logistics, operations that require intelligence and discretion. The pay will cover your sister's care indefinitely. The work will occasionally be dangerous. The hours will be unpredictable, and you will enter a world where the rules you've been taught do not apply. He paused, letting the weight of both options settle between them. You've proven you'll fight to protect what you love, even when fighting means survival over pride. That is valuable, possibly invaluable. Lee's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held something that might have been recognition. The first option is safety. The second is power. Choose. Carolyn looked at the handkerchief in her hands, at the monogram stitched in thread that probably cost more than her hourly wage, at the blood that had seeped into expensive linen and made it hers in a way money never could. She thought about Maya in that state facility where the nurses were overworked and the pain management was inadequate, where her little sister smiled through discomfort because complaining changed nothing. She thought about $100,000, about safety, about the fantasy of a quiet life where violence was something that happened to other people. Then she thought about 3 more years of triple shifts, 3 more years of calculating tips and swallowing humiliation and hoping the mathematics would eventually resolve themselves. 3 more years of being invisible until someone needed a target. Option 2, she said, and her voice didn't shake. Lee's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A fractional relaxation that might have been satisfaction. You understand what you're choosing? This is not a trial period. Once you enter my world, you cannot simply resign if it becomes uncomfortable. I understand that safety is a lie we tell ourselves. Carolyn met his eyes, held them. I've been safe my entire life. Safe and poor and one emergency away from catastrophe. That man tonight could have kicked me, could have broken my ribs, and the most the law would have done is fine him less than he spends on lunch. You're offering me something different. I'm offering you complicity, Lee corrected. The work I do exists outside legal frameworks. You will facilitate transactions that courts would call criminal. You will know things that could put you in prison if authorities ever connected the threads. And you will do these things not because you believe in some greater cause, but because it serves your survival and your sister's well-being. Yes, Carolyn said simply. I will. Lee extended his hand again, but this time the gesture carried different weight. Not assistance, but acknowledgement. She shook it, felt the controlled strength in his grip, understood that this was the moment her life divided into before and after. Go change, he said. Leave the uniform. You don't work here anymore. The staff locker room felt like visiting a museum of her former life. Carolyn stripped out of the white service uniform, the fabric still damp with spilled wine and humiliation, and pulled on her street clothes, jeans, and a sweater that suddenly felt inadequate for wherever she was going next. She left the uniform folded on the bench, her name tag placed carefully on top like a tombstone marker. Her locker held nothing she needed to take. Everything that mattered was already in her small backpack. Maya's photo, the notebook where she'd tracked impossible numbers, and now Lee's blood-stained handkerchief that felt like a contract written in biology rather than ink. When she emerged, Lee was waiting by the coat check with his 2 associates flanking him like architectural features. The restaurant had mostly emptied, the remaining diners pretending they hadn't witnessed anything unusual, the staff avoiding eye contact with the strange tableau near the entrance. Lee handed her a business card, matte black with a phone number in silver. Nothing else. No name, no title, no address. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., someone will collect you from your apartment. He said her address without her having given it. A casual demonstration of reach that should have been terrifying but somehow wasn't. She nodded, slipped the card into her pocket, and walked toward the door. Lee and his men fell into formation around her, not guarding exactly, but creating a perimeter that suggested she now occupied different territory than she had an hour ago. The maitre d' held the door, his face carefully blank, and Carolyn stepped out into the night, where the air tasted like salt and gasoline, and the future rushing toward her at velocity. She didn't look back at Aurelius, at the gilded cage where she'd spent 11 months making herself small. That version of her life had ended the moment her head hit marble, the moment a stranger had decided she was worth salvaging. Whatever came next would be dangerous and morally complex and probably shorten her life expectancy, but it would be hers. 4 months later, Carolyn sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that didn't officially exist in any of Lee's corporate filings, reviewing shipping manifests that documented cargo containers moving between Busan and Long Beach. The manifests were lies, of course elaborate fictions that listed automotive parts and textiles, while omitting the pharmaceuticals being moved through shell companies whose ownership disappeared into offshore labyrinths. Her job was to ensure the fictions remained internally consistent, that customs agents found nothing suspicious in the paperwork, that the numbers told a story boring enough to discourage deeper investigation. She wore a charcoal Armani suit that had been tailored to her frame, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested competence rather than submission, and when she spoke on the phone in English, Korean, or the fragmentary Mandarin she'd acquired through immersion and necessity, her voice carried the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. The transformation had happened faster than she'd anticipated, not because Lee had changed her, but because he'd simply removed the obstacles that had forced her to make herself small. The Long Beach inspection is scheduled for Thursday, she said into her headset, cross-referencing digital files against the physical manifests spread across the conference table. Make sure the priority containers are positioned mid-stack, maximum bureaucratic friction to access. If they select those for inspection, we have approximately 40 minutes to initiate contingency protocols. She listened to the response, made a note in her tablet. No. Tell him if he can't maintain the timeline, we'll find someone who can. We're not negotiating. She ended the call and looked up to find Lee standing in the doorway, watching her with that same assessing gaze he'd applied in Aurelius. She'd learned to read the micro-expressions now, the fractional shifts that indicated approval or concern. Right now, he looked satisfied, which from Lee qualified as effusive praise. The Seattle route? He asked. Resolved. The port official was developing conscience issues. I arranged for a conversation that helped him remember his priorities. She didn't elaborate. Lee didn't require elaboration. He'd hired her for exactly this, the ability to identify problems and implement solutions without requiring permission or validation. Your sister? The question came rarely enough that it still caught her off guard when he asked. Started the new treatment last week. The doctors say her pain levels have decreased significantly. Carolyn allowed herself a small smile. She's asking about college applications. Maya lived in the private facility now. The one with the ratio of nurses to patients that suggested humans rather than inventory, where experimental treatments were administered by doctors who published in medical journals rather than ones who'd lost their licenses elsewhere. The bills arrived monthly and were paid automatically from accounts Carolyn now managed. The numbers no longer impossible but simply data to be processed. She visited twice a week, watched Maya's face lose the tightness that chronic pain carved into young features, and understood that every law she broke, every shipment she facilitated, every uncomfortable conversation she conducted with men who preferred violence to negotiation, all of it purchased her sister's future. Good, Lee said, and meant it. He viewed loyalty as transactional but absolute. and Carolyn's loyalty was secured through Maya's well-being. It was the most honest relationship she'd ever had. No pretense of altruism, no performance of care, just the clear mathematics of mutual benefit. She turned back to her manifests, to the work of making illegal commerce appear legitimate, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the dignity of being valued for her competence, rather than tolerated for her compliance. The work was criminal, the hours were unpredictable. The moral compromises accumulated like interest on a loan she'd never fully repay. But when she signed documents in her clean, precise handwriting, when she solved problems that had stymied Lee's other operatives, when she walked through this glass tower in her tailored suit with her sister's future secured, she felt powerful. And power, she'd learned, was the only real safety that existed. Carolyn sometimes thought about that night at Aurelius, not often, but in quiet moments when the manifests were filed and the calls were finished, and she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city light up like a circuit board beneath her. She thought about the cold marble against her cheek, about Ashford's shoe hovering over her ribs, about the particular flavor of helplessness that came from knowing that no law would protect her, no authority would intervene, that her body and dignity were negotiable commodities in a system designed by people who'd never known vulnerability. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, calculating impossible mathematics in a staff locker room, believing that if she just endured enough, the universe would notice her suffering and reward it. That woman had been wrong about almost everything. The universe didn't notice. It didn't care. Survival required understanding power's actual mechanics, not its theoretical ones. Lee's world operated on different principles than the one she'd left behind. The rules here were harsh, cross him, and consequences arrived with the efficiency of compound interest. Fail to deliver and you were replaced, possibly permanently. Loyalty was rewarded proportionally and betrayal was addressed with the kind of finality that discouraged repetition. But within those parameters, the system was predictable. Lee didn't wake up cruel or generous depending on his mood. He didn't humiliate for sport or exercise power to feel substantial. He simply ran calculations and acted accordingly. It was, Carolyn had come to understand, more honest than anything she'd experienced in the legitimate world. At Aurelius, she'd been told she mattered while being treated as disposable. Here, Lee never pretended she was anything other than a valuable asset, and that clarity felt like respect. Tonight they stood together in a private dining room at a restaurant even more exclusive than Aurelius, the kind of place that didn't have a name, just an address known to people who shaped economies rather than participated in them. Across the table sat 3 men in expensive suits discussing a real estate acquisition that would displace 200 families and generate returns measured in multiples of 8 figures. The deal was legal, technically, but the pressure tactics that would ensure its success existed in spaces between statutes. Lee listened with that characteristic stillness, processing information with the efficiency of algorithms. When he glanced at Carolyn, she provided the detail he needed without him having to ask. The zoning variance was approved this morning. The appeals process has been streamlined. She didn't elaborate. The men across the table nodded, understanding that streamlined meant obstacles had been removed through channels they didn't need to examine. Miss Pittman has proven invaluable, Lee said to the room, though he was looking at her. She understands that power requires precision. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd heard from him, and coming from Lee it carried more weight than any performance review she'd received serving tables. The meeting concluded with handshakes and transfers initiated through encrypted channels. As the men departed, Lee remained at the table, reviewing documents with the focus he applied to everything. Carolyn stood by the window, watching the city reassemble itself below, and thought about the woman on the marble floor who'd whispered please. That woman had believed protection came from laws and authorities, from systems designed to defend the vulnerable. She'd learned the truth the hard way. Protection came from understanding violence and positioning yourself adjacent to those who wielded it effectively. Lee was a criminal. His organization trafficked in substances and information and influence that existed outside legal frameworks. The work she did facilitated suffering she'd never witnessed directly but couldn't deny indirectly. And yet, he'd seen her on that floor and recognized something worth salvaging. Not her suffering. Lee didn't traffic in sympathy, but her ruthless prioritization, her willingness to endure for something beyond herself. He'd offered her a choice when the world had offered only inevitability. He'd valued her competence when others had valued only her compliance. Ready? Lee asked, standing, his tone suggesting they had another meeting, another negotiation, another evening of reshaping reality through careful application of pressure and precision. Carolyn turned from the window, from the city that no longer felt like it was consuming her but like terrain she'd learned to navigate. Always, they walked out together. his trust in her absolute, her loyalty to him secured not through coercion but through the simple mathematics of mutual benefit. The Mafia boss was a criminal, built his empire on activities that destroyed as often as they created, operated in shadows that would never see legitimate light. But he was the one who'd truly seen her, and in the architecture of power that governed the real world, not the fantasy one she'd believed in that mattered more than morality ever could. If you understand what Carolyn learned on that marble floor, that real power comes from being seen, not saved, then subscribe now. New stories drop daily, each one revealing the architecture of power that governs us all. Don't just watch, understand.